Back at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned that culture in the early Middle Ages progressed slowly, if at all. As one Renaissance historian famously put it, it was a time when honorable study and fine scholarship were asleep. Well, things eventually picked up and intellectual progress resumed. It was centered in Paris, where great thinkers, teachers, theologians, and philosophers all gathered to share their knowledge with one another. Paris became the undisputed capital of France, intellectually, politically, and economically. The University of Paris was built during this time, and it was the very first medieval university. In fact, the whole concept of the university caught on very quickly. And by the end of the next century, there would be about 20 additional universities in Europe. There was another important structure built in Paris in the late 12th century called the Cathedral of Notre Dame. You see a picture of it down in the corner. If you can even imagine something like that being built in the Middle Ages. It was considered the most awe-inspiring monument to God that had ever been built. Not only did it inspire awe, but it inspired some great music as well. Certainly, monophonic chant was not going to be sufficient to fill the interior of this cathedral with sound, nor would the earliest types of polyphony, parallel organum, note against note counterpoint, none of those things would suffice in a building of this size. So polyphony was raised to a new level. It would take on far more contrapuntal independence. And if you're not familiar with that word contrapuntal, it's just the adjectival form of counterpoint. In other words, music that contains a lot of counterpoint is considered to be very contrapuntal. And just as a side note there in parentheses, I've indicated that substantive changes in music have often resulted from changes in architecture throughout the history of music. Just keep following that thread as we go through the history of music. There's also a note there at the bottom directing you to the Chapter 3 module in Blackboard, where you'll find a link to a short YouTube video on the Cathedral of Notre Dame. So please be sure to watch that. This new polyphony of the late 12th, early 13th centuries was actually named after the cathedral. It's called Notre Dame Polyphony. A composer we know simply as Léonin is one of the very first composers we know by name in the history of music. Most composers in the Middle Ages were composing anonymously in service of the church. Léonin composed a great deal of Notre Dame polyphony, as did the other famous composer from this time, who we know as Periton. And between the two of them, they are responsible for composing most of the music in the Magnus Liber. That translates as Great Book. The Magnus Liber is the first book of polyphony in the history of Western music. Okay, that will do it for this chapter. Please do be sure that you are very familiar with the different types of organum that we went through in the previous lectures before coming to class this week.